In October 1781, the British Empire still held New York City, still commanded one of the strongest navies on earth. It still expected rebellion to collapse under pressure. Yet in Virginia, a British army under Lord Cornwallis found itself boxed against the York River. American and French troops closed from the land, a French fleet sealed the Chesapeake, and George Washington finally had the trap he had been waiting for. The question is how 13 divided colonies survived long enough to make that trap possible. The story begins after 1763, when Britain emerged from the 7 Years' War with a larger empire and a larger debt. London expected the North American colonies to help pay for imperial defence. But many colonists believed they were being taxed by a parliament in which they had no elected voice. The dispute was not only about money, it was about who had the authority to govern life in Massachusetts, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New York, and the other colonies along the Atlantic coast. The Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, the Boston Massacre, and the Tea Act turned argument into confrontation. Protesters used boycotts, committees, and public pressure. British officials answered with troops and enforcement. After the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, Parliament punished Massachusetts with the Coercive Acts, known in the colonies as the Intolerable Acts. Boston Harbour was closed, local government was restricted, and many colonists began to fear that if Massachusetts could be disciplined this way, any colony could be next. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Georgia did not attend at first, but the crisis was already becoming continental. The colonies were not a unified nation, they had different economies, religions, ports, frontiers, and fears. Still, the Congress organised boycotts and defended Massachusetts as a shared cause. This matters for the map. The war would be fought across the modern states that had been the 13 colonies. Maine was then part of Massachusetts, and Vermont still a contested frontier. On April 19, 1775, British regulars marched from Boston toward Lexington and Concord to seize military supplies and assert control. About 700 British troops met local militia, first at Lexington, then around Concord's North Bridge, and finally along the road back to Boston. By the end of the day, thousands of militia from Massachusetts and nearby colonies were converging. The British reached Boston battered, and the countryside around the city shifted from protest to armed siege. In June 1775, colonial forces fortified Breed's Hill overlooking Boston. British troops attacked frontally, taking the position only after repeated assaults and heavy losses. The battle was a British tactical victory, but it showed that militia behind fieldworks could punish trained regulars. For the rebels, the lesson was sobering. Courage alone would not defeat the empire, but defensive ground, discipline, and local mobilisation could make every British advance expensive. The Second Continental Congress created the Continental Army and chose George Washington as Commander-in-Chief in June 1775. Washington arrived outside Boston to find an army that was brave but temporary, short of powder, short of supplies, and tied to enlistments that could expire. Around the city, one American formation icon represents thousands of soldiers, not one unit. This army was a coalition of Continental troops, local militia, artillery crews, and support networks trying to become a national force while already under pressure. In early 1776, Henry Knox brought heavy guns captured at Fort Ticonderoga across winter roads to the heights above Boston. When Washington placed artillery on Dorchester Heights, British commander William Howe judged the city too exposed to hold. In March 1776, the British evacuated Boston by sea. Massachusetts turned red on the map because the main British army left the state, but the war was not ending. It was moving toward New York, where Britain's navy could operate with far greater strength. On July 4, 1776, Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence. The war was no longer only a dispute over imperial authority. It became a fight over whether the United States could exist at all. The declaration also raised the diplomatic stakes because foreign powers could now treat the Americans as a political cause, rather than only rebellious subjects. But independence on paper did not create victory on the battlefield. Washington still had to face the largest British expedition yet sent against the colonies. New York was the obvious British target in 1776. Its harbour could support a fleet, its rivers offered routes inland. Its loyalist population gave Britain hope that rebellion was thinner than it looked. General William Howe arrived with roughly 32,000 British, Hessian and Loyalist troops. Washington had perhaps 19,000 effectives around New York, many inexperienced. If the British destroyed his army, independence might end before it had time to become real. At Long Island in August 1776, Howe outflanked the Americans and drove them back toward Brooklyn Heights. Washington's army was in grave danger, pinned with water behind it, and superior British forces in front. A night evacuation across the East River saved the army from destruction. New York City fell soon afterward and would remain the major British base for the rest of the war. On the state control layer, New York turns blue to show that strategic British foothold. After defeats around New York, Washington retreated across New Jersey toward Pennsylvania. Enlistments were expiring, morale was collapsing, and British commanders believed the rebellion might be close to exhaustion. New Jersey briefly became a corridor of pursuit, occupation, and foraging, while many civilians tried to guess which side would survive. Washington's problem was not only tactical. He had to keep an army together long enough for one counterstroke to matter. On Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the icy Delaware with about 2,400 men and struck the Hessian garrison at Trenton. A second success at Princeton followed in early January. These victories were small compared with the size of the British Empire, but they changed the psychological map. The Continental Army had not vanished. New enlistments became easier to secure. New Jersey resistance revived. Britain learned that occupying cities was not the same as controlling the countryside. By 1777, the war had become a contest for the Middle States: New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and the roads between them. Washington could not usually defeat the main British army in open battle, but he could keep it from destroying him. The American strategy was survival, harassment, and political endurance. The British strategy was to seize key cities, split rebel regions, and convince loyalists that imperial victory was inevitable. In 1777, Howe chose to move on Philadelphia, the rebel capital. Rather than marching directly across New Jersey, he transported his army by sea to the Chesapeake and advanced north. Washington tried to block him at Brandywine in September, with both armies fielding roughly 15,000 men. But the British again used manoeuvre to turn the American position. Philadelphia fell, and Pennsylvania temporarily turns blue to show the British occupation of the capital. The loss of Philadelphia was politically painful, but it did not end the rebellion because Congress escaped and Washington's army remained in the field. At Germantown in October, Washington attacked, but coordination broke down in fog and confusion. The Americans failed to retake the city, yet the campaign revealed the central British problem. They could capture major towns, but unless Washington's army was destroyed and local resistance collapsed, the rebellion could move, recover, and continue. While Howe moved on Philadelphia, a separate British plan aimed to split New England from the other colonies by controlling the Hudson Corridor. General John Burgoyne marched south from Canada with British regulars, German auxiliaries, loyalists, native allies, artillery, and a long supply train. A second column under Barry St. Leger moved through the Mohawk Valley. The plan depended on coordination, speed, and support. On the ground, forests, roads, militia, and supply problems turned that plan into a trap. At Saratoga in September and October 1777, American forces under Horatio Gates wore down Burgoyne's army. Benedict Arnold and Daniel Morgan provided aggressive battlefield leadership. Burgoyne started the campaign with roughly 8,000 men and ended surrounded, outnumbered, and short of options. His surrender on October 17 captured nearly 6,000 troops. The military result was important, but the diplomatic result was decisive. France now had evidence that the American cause could survive. In 1778, France allied with the United States, turning a colonial rebellion into a wider imperial war. French money, arms, officers, soldiers and naval power changed what was possible. Britain now had to defend the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, India and the home islands, not only the 13 colonies. This did not mean American victory was guaranteed. It meant Britain could no longer concentrate every resource on Washington, and it meant sea power might someday trap a British army far from New York. While Philadelphia was occupied, Washington's army endured the winter at Valley Forge. Hunger, disease, supply failure, and political criticism threatened the army's existence. But the camp also became a place of reorganization. Baron von Steuben helped standardize drill and command habits, making the Continental Army more reliable in battle. The war was not only fought by musket fire. It was fought through logistics, training, state governments, paper money, civilian labour, and the ability to keep soldiers in service. In 1778, the British evacuated Philadelphia and marched back toward New York. Washington attacked at Monmouth in New Jersey. This produced a hard-fought battle that showed the Continental Army could stand in the field better than it had in 1776. At the same time, French entry made Rhode Island important because Newport was a British base. The state turns blue during British occupation, but the wider map shows a deeper truth. Britain held ports while American resistance filled much of the interior. The Revolution was not only a coastal war. In New York, Pennsylvania, the Ohio Valley, and the southern backcountry, fighting involved continental troops, militia, loyalists, and native nations whose own survival strategies did not fit neatly into the Patriot versus British story. The Iroquois Confederacy divided under pressure, and frontier raids brought violence to farms and villages. These campaigns remind us that state colours simplify a war that was local, civil, imperial, and continental at the same time. After failing to crush Washington in the north, British leaders turned south. They believed Georgia and the Carolinas contained stronger loyalist support, valuable ports, and enslaved populations that could be used to destabilise Patriot society. Savannah fell in 1778 and Georgia turns blue. This southern strategy was not a side story. It became the decisive theatre of the later war because British commanders tried to rebuild royal authority from the coast inland, one occupied region at a time. In 1780, Sir Henry Clinton and Lord Cornwallis besieged Charleston, South Carolina, with land and naval forces. The American commander Benjamin Lincoln surrendered the city in May, and more than 5,000 American troops were captured. This was one of the worst American defeats of the war. South Carolina turns blue because Britain now held its main port and tried to restore royal government. But the occupation also ignited a vicious civil war in the backcountry. At Camden in August 1780, Cornwallis defeated an American army under Horatio Gates. The defeat seemed to confirm the British southern strategy. Georgia was occupied, Charleston had fallen, and another American army had been broken. But British control depended on loyalist militia, posts, roads, and intimidating the countryside. Patriot militia leaders such as Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens attacked supply lines and isolated detachments, turning the Southern War into a contest over local control rather than only formal battles. In October 1780, Patriot militia from the Carolina and Appalachian backcountry surrounded a loyalist force under Patrick Ferguson at Kings Mountain. The battle was fought mostly between Americans on opposite sides of the Revolution, which is why the war can also be understood as a civil conflict inside an imperial conflict. Ferguson was killed, and his force was destroyed or captured. The victory checked British momentum and warned Cornwallis that the backcountry could not simply be pacified by proclamation. At Cowpens in January 1781, Daniel Morgan used a layered defence against Banastre Tarleton's aggressive British legion. Militia fired, withdrew as planned, and drew the British forward into Continental infantry and cavalry counterattack. Morgan had roughly 1,000 men. Tarleton had a little over 1,000. The American victory destroyed an important British mobile force. On the map, arrows show why this mattered. Cornwallis still had to chase Nathanael Greene across a wide southern theatre, while his own army became harder to supply. In March 1781, Cornwallis attacked Greene at Guilford Courthouse in North Carolina. The British won the field but suffered losses they could not easily replace. Greene's strategy was not to hold every position. It was to make Cornwallis pay for every advance, preserve American forces, and pull the British deeper into a hostile landscape. After Guilford, Cornwallis moved toward Virginia. That decision connected the Southern campaign to the final trap at Yorktown. Virginia mattered because it was rich, populous, and full of supply targets. British raids threatened depots, government, and communications. Lafayette shadowed Cornwallis with a smaller American force, avoiding destruction while reporting British movements. Cornwallis eventually moved to Yorktown and Gloucester Point on the York River, expecting the Royal Navy to keep him connected. The state turns blue during this phase to show the British operational foothold. But the danger was more specific. Cornwallis had chosen a coastal position that could become a prison. Washington had spent years watching the British base in New York, but in 1781 he and the French commander Rochambeau made a decisive choice. Instead of attacking New York, they marched south toward Virginia while trying to keep British commanders uncertain. One American infantry icon now represents thousands of Continentals. One French-coloured formation represents thousands of French regulars. Their movement only made sense if the French Navy could block the Chesapeake before the Royal Navy rescued Cornwallis. In September 1781, the French fleet under de Grasse fought the Royal Navy near the Chesapeake Capes. The battle was not a dramatic land assault, but strategically it was enormous. The British failed to regain control of the bay. Cornwallis could no longer rely on evacuation or reinforcement by sea. For once, Washington's army, French infantry, French artillery, American troops, militia, and naval power all synchronized around one point on the map. At Yorktown, the Allied army dug siege lines closer and closer to the British defences. American and French artillery battered the works. Assaults on redoubts tightened the ring, and Cornwallis's attempted escape across the river failed. The numbers were now reversed from New York in 1776. Around 19,000 Allied troops faced roughly 8,000 British, German, and Loyalist troops. The Empire's army was not beaten by one miracle charge. It was trapped by geography, patience, alliance, and timing. On October 19, 1781, Cornwallis's army surrendered. The surrender did not immediately end the war, and Britain still held New York, Charleston, Savannah, and other positions. But it destroyed the political argument that victory in America was still worth the cost. In London, the defeat changed the debate. The military map had finally produced a political result. Britain could keep fighting, but it could no longer easily explain how it would win. After Yorktown, armies still watched each other, and diplomats still argued over borders, debts, prisoners, fisheries, and recognition. Fighting and danger did not vanish overnight. Loyalists feared retaliation. Enslaved people who had sought British protection faced uncertain futures. Native nations confronted a new American republic that would press westward. A documentary map can show surrender markers, but the human aftermath was slower, messier, and far wider than one battlefield. The core rebellion involved the 13 colonies that became states: New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. Maine appears because it was then part of Massachusetts. Vermont appears because the northern frontier was militarily important even before it became a state. Control was never perfectly statewide. Blue marks major British strategic footholds. Red marks the American-controlled or Patriot-dominated state layer underneath. The armies used infantry as the main battlefield arm. Regulars, Continentals, militia, Hessian auxiliaries, loyalists, and light infantry. Cavalry and mounted troops were smaller but important for scouting, raids, pursuit, and shock in battles such as Cowpens. Artillery decided sieges, defended heights, and made positions like Boston and Yorktown untenable. Each icon on this map represents a formation or operational force, not one soldier or one cannon. The labels give approximate scale when the historical numbers are known. Exact totals vary by source because enlistments expired, militia appeared for short campaigns, disease reduced strength, and returns were uneven. At peak moments, Britain could send tens of thousands of regular German, loyalist, and naval personnel into the theatre. The Continental Army usually fought with far fewer effective soldiers than paper strength suggested, supported by militia and state forces. The American advantage was not constant numerical superiority. It was endurance across many states, local intelligence, foreign alliance, and the ability to survive defeats. The Treaty of Paris, signed in 1783, recognized the independence of the United States and set borders that stretched far beyond the original coastal settlements. British troops evacuated New York in November 1783, the last major British-held city. For patriots, this was a triumph. For many loyalists, it was exile. For native nations and enslaved people, the outcome was far more uncertain. The war against the British Empire had ended, but the argument over what liberty would mean inside the new republic had only begun. Washington did not win because he defeated every British army in open battle. He won because he kept the Continental Army alive, forced Britain to fight across distance and time, used geography when direct strength was lacking, and accepted alliance when American resources were not enough. The British Empire could win battles, seize cities, and terrify regions. What it could not do was convert those victories into permanent political control before the cost of the war became too high. The American War of Independence was therefore not a simple march from protest to victory. It was a war of ports, rivers, state governments, militia networks, foreign fleets, winter camps, sieges, civil conflict, and repeated moments when the rebellion nearly failed. The map ends in red because the United States survived. But the deeper story is how survival itself became strategy, and how a trapped army at Yorktown revealed that an empire could occupy ground without truly winning the war.